Hello, this video will be about indigo dyeing. In it, I will be explaining the basics of an indigo vat, but due to current limitations on supplies and time, it will be made with more modern ingredients. A lot of my interest in indigo lies in the science behind indigo dyeing, and as such, any terms that I use will be explained either in the video or, if I forget at the time, later in my page. If I've forgotten to explain anything, feel free to ask. As a vat takes time and patience to develop, some parts of the video will be time-lapsed for brevity's sake. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy. Hi, I'm Isabella Del Firenze, and I'm going to run you through creating an indigo dye vat. Now I'm here in my kitchen. I just do this on my stove, trying to take care because indigo does have a tendency of dyeing a lot of things it touches. However, the good news is that it usually comes out pretty easily if you get to it quickly. And it doesn't, depending on when it touches something, it doesn't always permeate, because the thing with indigo is it has to be in a specific state in order to get through fibers and dye them, which is part of what I'm going to cover today. So my basic materials here is I've got my stove. You can do this over any sort of heat source. The trick is you don't want it to get too hot, because then you'll generally kill the indigo. However, you can do it over a fire. It's just a lot harder to control the temperature. I've got a fairly regular stock pot here. This one's been used for indigo a few times. Don't use it for food after. This is one of my dedicated dye pots. And then I've got a container of distilled water that is very heavy, so I'm not going to lift it up to the camera. I use distilled water because indigo requires a certain pH balance, and it's easier to start with distilled water, or at least as distilled as you can get it. I prefer not to pay for distilled water, so I ran a bunch of tap water through my Brita filters. But the closer the pH is to neutral, the easier it is for me to manipulate it in the dye vat. Tap water, it always depends on where you are. So if you're not sure of the particular pH balance of your tap water, I recommend getting a pH reader, an electronic one, or the strips, where you can test the pH. Until you get comfortable with dyeing with indigo, you'll need to have those tests. I have figured out kind of how it's supposed to look, smell, feel, so I won't be using a pH meter today. So I've got a pot, I've got the distilled water, I've got these lye crystals here, and just realizing that may be backwards on the video. We'll see. I've got these lye crystals to make the vat alkaline as opposed to acidic. So we're trying to go up the pH meter towards the kind of 11, 12-ish range. That's where indigo's happiest. I've also got what's called a reducing agent. This is a modern one, and it's called thiourea dioxide. And what it does is it removes the oxygen from the vat. Oxygen is what, at the end of this, will turn the indigo back to blue. So there's a whole bunch of chemistry involved in indigo vats. On my Athenaeum page, which this is mostly for, though I may post it elsewhere, there's an entire section on the chemistry behind indigo, which can get very complicated and very interesting if that's the way your mind works. It's not for everyone. So in any case, it's something that removes the oxygen from the vat. The there are more historical methods that usually involve fruit. Most people will know of urine indigo vats, which I refuse to do, but the urine vats are the most common historically, simply because with the urine you have all of the ingredients you need. It's already alkaline, generally speaking, and it has the sugars needed for the bacteria and the ammonia to kind of reduce what's the oxygen that's in the back, to eat the oxygen and reduce it. However, I understand not many people want to do it. It takes a lot of urine collection to get the amount you need. You then have to keep it around your house for a while. I've read a few that recommend that it be stale. I've read a couple of other sources that recommend that the urine comes from a strong man who drinks, essentially. It's not something I'm interested in doing. In any case, you can use, there's fruit vats. Bananas are popular, as are dates. You can also do a madder, so the madder root vat, where you have the madder root, and then you also have, I believe that one is, you want some sort of food for the bacteria, so something like a wheat bran that you've done up. A very common term in some of the historical sources I've read is something like strong water, which is essentially fermented bran water. You take wheat bran and you soak it 4 days on end, and then you harvest the water from it. You can also do a henna vat. Both henna and madder will affect the color slightly, but it'll generally darken it, which is lovely. Indigo has a fantastic tendency that with the darker colors, it will just override every other color. So be careful with over dyeing. It is possible. You have to make a very light indigo vat for that, where you take like something that's been dyed one color and then you dye over it with indigo for other interesting effects, or like party color or something like that. I tried it once and it just turned blue because my indigo vat was too strong. Other types of historical indigo vats. I can't think of any other. Oh, the other way of making it darker is to add like iron, so like a ferrous sulfate, if you have the powder, or just old nails. Old rusted nails. You just toss those in and you might be able to get a darker color out of it. Moving on, some other materials I've got. I've got 2 different styles of indigo. So I've got these indigo chunks here, which are very common to how they would be shipped in historical times. It's how they came out of India a lot of the time, which actually led to people thinking it was a mineral and not a plant, because it just came in these chunks that they thought was mined. Or at least some people thought that. And then there's also, of course, just you can't really see through that, but just a powder. Let's see if I can do this. There we go, just a powder. So I could either grind down the chunks or just use this powder I have. It is recommended for most people. You'll note that I don't follow my own recommendations very often. It is recommended that you use gloves and wear a mask while working with, especially if you're doing the more modern with the chemicals and stuff. These are very fine powders and many of them are lung irritants, so you don't want to breathe them in. I'm just not going to breathe them in. I am wearing an apron, mostly to just protect my clothes, but I'm very much not wearing gloves. Part of the way I tell if the indigo vat is ready is actually by touching it, and touching it will dye my fingers, but I can't tell through gloves whether or not it's ready. So I need to actually touch it. The last thing I have here, which is something I'm not going to use, but I do want to show, and this is part of my collection of dried Japanese indigo leaves. And I've grown and collected these over the past few years. We're just going to hold these up. So I just dried them. They've kept very well. And eventually I will use them once I've gathered enough, because you need a lot of indigo and I don't have the room to grow most of it. I grow it in containers. So, and I don't have a farm, but if you're using plant material like that, from the actual plant, you don't need, like if you're doing the historical way, you don't need to then add sugar. So normally what happens is, the way you reduce the oxygen in the vat is you essentially create a haven for bacteria, and the bacteria eat the oxygen they consume the oxygen. They excrete generally ammonia and carbon dioxide, which just takes the oxygen out of the vat, which is what you want. But in order for them to have a good environment, they need food. If you're doing something with with a powder that's already been kind of taken from the plant material and reconstituted into a powder, or into a chunk anyway, if you're doing that, it no longer has the sugar attached to it. So the plant material has two molecules. One of them is the indigo and one of them is sugar. And if you're using the plant, then all you need is to make the alkaline environment and essentially ferment the leaves so that you give these bacteria, but the food is already in the plant, as opposed to the powder where it's not. So if you're doing the powder, you need to make sure to add some sort of food, some sort of sugar. Honey works, fructose works, fruit. That's why fruit's such a great historical vat. But you don't need to do that if you're just using the plant. So anyways, let's get started. Got my distilled water here. That should do it. What you want in your vat is you want enough room, depending on what you're trying to dye. So if you're trying to dye big things, you want, you probably either want to do it in parts, or you want a very, very large pot. I'm just doing the very, very small things that I made in my shibori video, so I don't need a ton of room, but I do want to kind of add them all in at once, so I want to be able to move them around. So I'm going to put this on. I'm actually going to put it on really hot to start, because I want it to warm up quickly. And then I'll start adding ingredients. And we are back. So this is warmed up rather nice. I've turned down the heat. It's a little hot to the touch. So I might just let that go down a little bit more. But overall, you don't want it boiling. You don't want it cold. So I've added a couple of extra tools while I had the camera off. I forgot these, but they're just kind of dedicated tools. Some tongs to pick stuff up from out of the dye, so I don't have to stick my entire arm in. And then this is just a wooden spoon that I've used many times for indigo. So it used to be brown, now it's blue. And that's just for stirring. And then I just have like some paper towel to, so I don't have to wipe my hands on other things, and so that the tools have something to lay on. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start with the lye crystals. And there are a lot of places where you can find out how much to put in, measurements. Maiwa, which is the natural dye shop in Vancouver, BC, which is where I got all of the supplies. They have instructions. There are a lot of places to find instructions. I do this completely by feel, which, I mean, is really more historical in the end. Once you kind of get used to it, you know what you need, right? So, just put in some lye, like this. Half a line. Okay. So, there, not dyed at all hand. Just gonna stick it in. And there's blue on it, but it's not really dyeing my fingers. That's because the indigo hasn't reached the state where it can actually dye things. So now I'm gonna add this thiourea dioxide. And this is where kind of a balancing act comes in that you don't want to remove too much oxygen because that also acidifies the solution. But you also need to make sure that the oxygen is coming out. So mix that. Again, don't want to add too much to the vat. Okay. And now we're just going to let it sit and figure itself out, and we'll be back shortly. I've gone and moved the camera so that you can hopefully see what I'm looking at here, which is that this indigo vat is starting to do its work. This top bit here, it's almost like a little crust with the bubbles. That's what's known as the bloom, and that's kind of the sign you want to see, particularly when you're doing this with historical methods. You want to see that bloom because that means everything's working and that the oxygen is being reduced from the vat. Also, I don't know if the camera can catch this, but underneath that, it's not really a blue color. It's kind of this greeny yellow color, and that again is something you want to see, because that is actually the indigo working. When indigo is in the right state to start dyeing stuff, it's not blue in the vat. It's this kind of greeny yellow color. You can kind of see it. I'm going to put my hand in. As it comes out, see, it's dyeing my hand much more readily now. But if I do it quickly enough, as the oxygen hits it, it turns blue. But before that, it's kind of this pale greeny yellow color. It's a lot easier to see on fabric, which is what we're going to do next. Now that that is basically ready to go. And for the record, that took, how long have I been filming? I've maybe been filming in total, from setup to finish, for about an hour and a half. So the actual time that it took for this vat to get ready once I got the water heated and started adding stuff was maybe only 20-25 minutes. And I happened to hit kind of the right proportions for what I needed. So I'm going to grab the stuff. So for anyone who didn't watch the shibori video or who has forgotten, these are kind of the things we're working with. So I've got this folded shibori here. I've got this kind of cloud one that I worked up. Got this one with all the rocks inside of it. We've got this other folded one that I did. We've got this stitched one that I did, kind of very basic stitched one. This kind of combination of the close wound, and then I did a couple of more of these open wound ones just to see how they turn out. And then last night I did an entire piece in the close wound fashion. You can see there's a few places where I lost tension and lost a couple of strands, so hopefully that, I tried to fix them, but I mostly just had to go over them again. You can see the back there, how interesting that ends up being as well. Now, for putting stuff into the vat, like I've mentioned a few times, you want to be sure that you are not introducing oxygen in. So you can use tongs if you want. It's easier to pull stuff out with tongs at least. But you want to be very, very gentle. So put that in. Just kind of let it go. You kind of want to make sure that they're going to be at least somewhat submerged. So some of these lighter ones may need a weight. In which case I'm just going to put something on top of them to hold them under the water there. Mostly it's the popsicle sticks because they float, but stuff like the fabric, once it gets wet, it will just go down. And yes, you can lose stuff at the bottom of an indigo vat. I've done it. You get a surprise when you empty out your indigo vat later. See how those bubbles coming up as I try not to get too much indigo in there. And yeah, we're just gonna submerge all of these. That one's gonna need a weight, it seems. So I'm just gonna put this, just kind of place it down at the bottom there. And the other one. Oops, no, didn't quite get it. Is that it? Nope. It's a hard one with these floaters, is that kind of gotta angle them so that they sit properly. And yeah, that's just, we're just gonna leave that there. For dyeing with indigo, there's a whole bunch of different ways you can do this. You can make a very, very light vat and dip for very, very short periods of time. And then just keep dipping until you get the color that you want. If you're wanting really dark colors, you can start with a really dark indigo vat. Or you can start with kind of a medium one and then just dip multiple times. There are so many ways that I've heard people suggest to do this, where you dry in between each dip so you can see kind of how it's looking and whether or not you want to redip. Or there's the, you just kind of rinse it out, and once you do, you can then immediately dip it again. And really, I haven't seen any particular benefit to any way. I usually won't wait for it to dry unless I think I'm good and I want to see it dry, and then I decide that no, it needs more, because I don't usually keep the indigo vat going. The indigo vat will continue for as long as you keep feeding it and keep the oxygen out of it. As time progresses, it will get oxygen. That reducing agent will get used up. It'll get used up the more you dye in it as well. And so historical vats will, as long as you keep feeding it, will keep going forever. It's kind of like sourdough starter. You keep feeding it and you keep it in the right conditions and it will go forever. modern vat, because I'm using something like thiourea dioxide, if I let this kind of go stagnant and stop dyeing things, I could probably revive it with enough lye and thiourea dioxide. Depending on how old it is, it's sometimes just not worth it, and it's just better to start fresh. But yeah, indigo is resilient that way. So the thing with shibori and indigo dyeing, though, is that if you're going to dye it multiple times, you do not remove the binding. So if you remove the binding, it's done. The only kind of exception I'll say to that is if you want like a really dark outside, but like a lighter blue where the binding was, so you can go as dark as you want on the outside and then remove the binding and do a final dip so that that interior, that stuff that's supposed to be resisted, gets a much lighter color to it. And while this is going, I'm just going to make mention of the fact that, particularly with a modern one, I am using chemicals, I'm using lye. You want to dispose of these vats properly. That means essentially getting a whole bunch of oxygen into it, which might just mean leaving it for a long time, which is why this one is dyed so blue, actually, because I left a vat just kind of sitting in it. Or you can slosh it into multiple containers if you have them and just go back and forth until it essentially turns blue again and you know that the oxygen is back in, because that will, again, neutralize the pH. Or you can just, if you're like outside, just stir it a whole bunch, slosh it around. Stirring it, depending on how big your container is, may not be the best idea because you can't guarantee you're getting in there, and you never want to dump it down the drain. Do not dump it down a modern kitchen drain or anything. Okay, what I'm going to do, that's good. I'm actually going to take this one down. Okay, that's that one down again. Probably lost it again. Yeah. Oh well. Okay, I'm actually just going to pull this one out. So watch the fabric as I pull this out. I'll make sure we're filming here. But you see that kind of greenish yellow? And then as the air hits it, it will start to turn blue. All of the stuff that's like blue and kind of clumpy, that's just from the top bloom and will wash out. But watch that color change. I really hope the camera is getting this. It's at such an angle I can't watch it, so. Also, I'm not doing it for this because I want to show this off, but it's recommended that you do rinse it out right away, because if you look at all of kind of these little blobs, those will make kind of darker patches. I don't mind in this because this is just a sample, and it's more important to me to show this color change. Let it sit here in the air for a second, but you can get streaks and stuff like that, especially if you're working with larger items. There is also the recommendation that you're supposed to make all of the fabric damp before you put it in to eliminate stuff like streaks. And while I understand that, and it does work better for larger items, for these smaller ones, you're not really waiting too much as the fabric gets damp. So, because there's not really that delay in getting the fabric in there, I'm not as concerned with wetting it beforehand. Ooh, that's changing. That's lovely. But if I were doing anything larger, like scarves, or I helped someone with a dress, and the first dip did leave it a tiny bit streaky because we didn't dampen it beforehand, and it took a while to get it into the pot. And also the pot we were working with was a lot smaller than it should have been, but it's what we had at the time. And yeah, so I definitely at that point recommend. Though if you do it that way, because I just remembered another reason why there were streaks, you want to make sure as you're putting it in that there's no wrinkles, because again, you'll get that resist dye aspect without trying. And if you don't want streaks, you want to make sure that at the very least in the first kind of dip into the vat, all of those wrinkles are kind of spread out, so you make sure that the dye reaches. Stuff like that, it's really good to have gloves for, because then you're getting your hands right in there, and making sure that it hits all of those spots. But okay, that's getting significantly blue. I'm gonna put it back in. Definitely just come on. I'm just gonna try and catch the other one with it too. Yes, no, sort of. It's mostly under. This is why the ones with the rocks are particularly good as well, because they weigh it down. Yeah, so I'm going to leave it in there for a little while, and we will check back. I'm going to say in about 5-10 minutes, and then I'll pull all these out and rinse them, and show you what we've got before I take the showboy out. They will. I want them to completely dry before I unbind them, so that will be a separate time, a separate section later in the, maybe I'll attach it to the end of this, but I will show you what it looks like before it starts to dry, and then make another video later once they're actually dry and I can take the bindings out. And we're back. So I know that I said you don't want to dispose of the indigo in your kitchen sink, and that is still true. However, when rinsing out the individual items, it's not the worst thing in the world, because as you run it under the water, you are adding oxygen, and therefore neutralizing the solution before it goes down the sink there. I would not dump an entire vat down there, but the amount of indigo and everything that's going to come out of there, or out of the pieces as you rinse them, is negligible. I've also got just this little bowl, as you can see, has indigo in it. I've used it repeatedly because my stove and my kitchen sink are on opposite sides of the kitchen, and I don't have a lot of room right next to my kitchen sink. I just, if it's small enough, dump it into here, bring it over, run it. So I'm going to run water now. You kind of want to run it kind of warm. You don't want to chill your fingers, but you don't want to burn them either. So I'm just going to do that. So I'm just going to do a couple at a time. As you can see, nice bright yellow. You want to try and get all of that sediment off so that you get fewer streaks as it does dry. Ooh, yeah, see, got some of those blotches here on this one because of how I pulled it out that one time. But that's okay. It adds to the art of it. See the color starting to kick in there. And again, I'm not unwrapping these because I don't want the dye to seep into the sections where I've tried to resist it. And you want the water to run clear when you do this, so that you're pretty sure all of the indigo has come out. At least as much as you can get. It's hard with these because you can't really squeeze the indigo out when, like you can with a bunch of fabric. So you can see it's really, really blue liquid going down there, and that's what you want. So it's suddenly super unfortunate I didn't have my camera at the other spot, because you can kind of see here, this came out bright yellow, which was really interesting actually. It's usually not that bright. It will often come out kind of this greeny color. So, interested to see what we get out of this. As you can see with this kind of fabric, I can just kind of squeeze, make sure all of the dye is coming out. Yeah, this one came out super bright yellow as well. Again, very odd, actually. I've never seen it that color. That might be a higher, I'd almost say it's a higher lye, or a higher alkalinity than usual. Reminder that this is silk, so sometimes it doesn't always play well at the higher alkalinity, but I've always had very good results with it. To this point, if I wanted to, I could decide that this is going to dry significantly later, and I could decide that I want it darker than it is, and I would put it in for another bath. But I am going to leave these. I don't want to do too many baths, so I'm just going to leave these as is. I think this is the last of it. But yeah, the fact that it's blue going down the drain means that the oxygen is back into it. It's going to be really interesting, I think. You'll also want to do another rinse once you do take all of this stuff out, because then you can really squeeze out any of that indigo that's been trapped. Be careful with these wound ones, because too much manipulation and it could just pop the strings. I'll be careful with that. I think that's it. I'll show you what we've got now. Make the camera do it. Here we go. So those are all the pieces that I've done, and I'm just gonna let them sit there and dry until they're completely dry. The ones like the sewn one are probably gonna dry first, whereas the one I completely bound up will be dry the slowest. And then I will take another video when I untie them all.